This is Duke University.
As contemporary images like the first of the two to be projected here today will show, we can little doubt that the Chinese of today have entered into commercial relations of a hitherto unmatched scale with the peoples of Africa. With trade between Africa and China having increased some 700% over the course of the 1990s, a Chinese mercantile presence is now a fixture in a host of sovereign African nations, even in many of those that are in the west of the continent instead of along China's familiar arc of East Africa, and in those that have recently struggled or are currently struggling mightily to maintain stability, such as Liberia and Sierra Leone. Owing to threats like the now suppressed Ebola epidemic and Mali, as well as just a couple of weeks ago when I was preparing this particular lecture, the Ivory Coast, owing to threats like Al-Qaeda. China became Africa's largest #1 trading partner in 2009 and has continued to be so with no signs, despite even China's own slowdown in economic growth, of that abating. Yet perhaps of greater interest to all, especially in light of the title of the talk that is drawn, lured, or in the cases of some of you students, perhaps even mandated that you be here, is the fact that Africans, for their part, and in quite consequential numbers, have, for commercial reasons, come in very recent years to reside in China, Best estimates put the figure between 20 and 30,000, with half as many illegal as legal immigrants. By contrast, the number of Chinese presently in Africa is estimated to be in excess of 1 million. And within the next couple of decades, the projected number is thought to probably will increase by several more million. Most Africans in China hail from Nigeria, Africa's most populous country. And most are concentrated in a single famous southern port city of Guangzhou, where they eke out difficult and often ghettoized lives, and yet lives that are nonetheless thought to be considerably better than those they would have to endure back in their African homelands. Although some awareness of what I have fleetingly described may already be well known to at least some of you, there's a misguided tendency, certainly on the part of most of us, to think that the situation of the Black in China is entirely new, a novel circumstance that is the result of only our most recent times. However, in keeping with the seemingly endless trend in global historical discovery that is revealing almost daily that there was probably earlier and more contact between the disparate peoples of the world than we have long assumed, I will endeavor over the course of the next 50 minutes or so to persuade you otherwise, and hopefully, in the process, make the persuasive case for a different and fuller understanding of the experience of the Black in China. In a somewhat contrarian manner, let me start off with a confession. and that is to admit that the first Blacks ever to enter into China were not really Blacks at all, at least not in the geo-restrictive sense of the term by which we currently operate. Indeed, the peoples in question, the only ones to whom we can ascribe the dubious distinction of being China's very first Blacks, were actually tribal peoples comprising the vast variety of ethno-extractions that populated the Malayan Peninsula, as well as the numerous kingdoms of the expansive Indonesian archipelago. This was the watery realm referred to in Chinese sources as Nanhai, the Southern Sea. And the earliest authors of these sources suggest very strongly that the Chinese had familiarized themselves with the inhabitants of this region through contact stretching back an indeterminate number of centuries. This familiarity was not without its antagonisms or contempt, and it is largely because of the occasional dysfunctional nature of relations that we first come to know not only of the existence of China's earliest Blacks, but also the term of disparagement that Chinese used to refer to them. The Tang Dynasty, one of China's greatest, spanning from the Common Era, or the Western year 618 to 907, is renowned for its cultural achievements, especially in literature, of which poetry, both then as well as now, is regarded as the most esteemed form. Given its great range of subject matter, we thus should not be surprised that one of the earlier references to China's Blacks comes to us via a poem written by a man of letters, Zhang Ji, who lived from 765 to about the year 830. The poem is titled, quite appropriately, Kunlun, which was the long-standing term for, specifically in this case, male Black slaves. In it, Zhang Ji observes the following. Home to the Kunlun is the isles amidst the Southern Sea. Yet led forth by Man visitors, they come to roam Han lands. Parrots and cockatoos must have taught them speech. As riding upon billowing waves, they first entered through the region of teeming forests, the Yulianzhou in Guangxi province, modern-day Guangxi province. Gold rings once dangled luridly from their ears. With conch-spiraled hair, long and coiling, they still refuse to bind their heads. Black as lacquer is their flesh and skin received from nature. Half stripped of tree floss garments, they stride about with bodies exposed, which of course is a very bad thing among Chinese. From other records of the Tang Dynasty, such as the older version of the two official histories, we learn that the Kunlun, as they consistently became called, had initially enjoyed a certain measure of sovereign autonomy in their relations with the Chinese. For they had long been seafaring merchants who annually arrived at the port of Guangzhou laden with valuable goods to trade with the Chinese. And that's a quote. However, Zhang Ji's poem makes it quite clear that those Kunlun of subsequent times who either entered South China voluntarily or more likely were forcefully brought there, were frequently subjected to slavery, stripped of their freedom as well as their wealth. It is unclear whether the slaves Zhang Ji here describes were official or private slaves. Tang China was stocked with both types. More probable, however, was that these captive, barely clad laborers that he describes were of the private type. Merchants supplied private slaves to wealthy customers for a price. Most of their goods were foreigners or aboriginal peoples living in the southern districts of China. This matter of the foreignness of the slaves is crucial because, interestingly, it had been taboo since ancient times to sell Chinese, and the Tang legal code imposed a stiff penalty for doing so. Kidnapping a person to sell as a slave was a capital offense, requiring execution by strangulation. Needless to say, the threat of such a fate as this one pictured here, proved to be a powerful disincentive to anyone contemplating abducting one of his own ethnic Han countrymen and selling him or her into bondage. The curious and almost counterintuitive result, however, of the affixing of the term Kunlun to these very first of China's blacks is that a name originally meant to discriminate over time becomes so very undiscriminating. We indeed find that Kunlun becomes progressively and indiscriminately applied as a designation for a plethora of peoples that clearly, from our modernist standpoint, are not at all related. Here again, the older of the two Tang official histories, the Zhou Tangshu, aids us greatly in appreciating this point, for it succinctly states, from Champa, present-day eastern coastal Vietnam, southward, all are curly-haired Chen Fa, black-bodied Haitian, and we comprehensively call them Kunlun. With the advance of time, this already expansive zone of black inhabitants would become stretched even further. And accordingly, with the transition from the Tang to the next major dynasty, the Sung dynasty, it came to encompass more terrains to the west as well as to the south. The inevitable result would be that whereas all Malays were potentially Kunlun, not all Kunlun were Malays. Thereby, the stage became set for the entrance and incorporation of what, from our contemporary perspective, were the first true blacks, those originating from the eastern coast of Africa, fully into Chinese consciousness as well as into the Chinese world. Although Chinese geographical knowledge of Africa dates from at least the late Tang period, being first mentioned without doubt by an author who died in about the year, or who died definitely, excuse me, in the year 863. Only with the advent of the Sung era can we speak with credible certainty of the high plausibility, if not probability, of an African presence on Chinese soil. The clearest evidence of this early appearance of what were almost certainly Africans is an unembellished but nonetheless authentic, given its embeddedness, again in an official source, reference. And this time, that particular reference is the Sung Shi, the Sung official history, or simply the history of the Sung. In it, natives of presumably East Africa are actually described as entering the imperial circle in connection with an official mission of tribute in honor of the newly ascendant Emperor Taizong, who was received, this mission was received at the Chinese court. We learned from this terse entry the following. In 977, envoy Pusina and Vice Commissioner Mohamo and administrative assistant Pulo and others made an offering of tribute to the court and of goods of their locality. Their servants had deep-set eyes and black bodies. They were called Kunlun, slaves. By imperial decree, in return, these envoys were given suits of garments with lining, utensils, and currency. Their servants were given variegated silk fabric with defects. This passage, which chronicles the celebratory arrival of a delegation from distant Persia, Bosu, is revealing on several levels. Not the least reason is its importance for its overt connection, if not identification, with the preeminently exalted ritual of tribute in China. The age-old practice whereby the Chinese throne regularly received and repaid gifts of submission from surrounding lesser countries, and the vastly more commonplace and quotidian act of trading. This connection with the tribute ritual also verges suggestively on, but does not quite succeed in introducing us to one of the established channels whereby Blacks historically became official slaves in China. Being the curiosities that they were, servants such as those attending these Persian emissaries were often among the gifts given to the Chinese court. However, the slaves attached to this seminal delegation no doubt soon departed China to return with their masters back to Persia. After all, if these slaves were given such goods in return for transporting the gifts of tribute delivered to the Chinese throne by their masters, we must assume that they were then allowed to take their defective silk, along with their own benighted selves, away. If these servants of the Persian envoys were only meant to be retained in bondage in China, there would not have been any reason for gifting them with anything, not to mention silk fabric of any value. With the demise of the Sung dynasty at the hands of the Mongols and their establishment of the Yuan dynasty, This situation in which blacks seem to have been present in China and yet held status no higher than that of slaves continued. The evidence attesting to this fact is not only literary, but also visual, and sometimes famously so, quite famously so. The painting here projected is the renowned Kublai Khan hunting, Yuan Shizu Chu Lie Tu, attributed to the court artist Liu Guandao. Briefly considering the images of the two blacks among the 10 horsemen engaged in this facsimile of the customary Mongol royal hunt, we find that in part because of the resplendent red in which he is donned, the background mounted figure nearer the ermine-clad Kublai himself better succeeds in capturing our attention. In such finery, we might assign to him the status of a tribal chieftain. Right? However, the clearly visible tattoo of the Chinese character ya, meaning servant or subordinate, and interestingly, a term that is more closely associated with females than males. The clearly visible tattoo, everybody see it? Marks him as probably a manservant, bedecked though he may be, with his face symbolically marked to indicate his condition of fealty, if not outright servitude, to the great Khan. Also, still later, during the period of transition from the Mongol Yuan dynasty back to native Chinese rule under the Ming dynasty, there is a sparse but definite literary reference attesting to the presence of blacks within China. Moreover, much of this evidence indicates how thoroughly the range of this presence had expanded beyond the South, migrating north. The philosopher Yeziqi, writing certainly with some exaggeration, nonetheless states that as for Northerners, for maids, they must get Goryeo, or Korean, Gaoli girls, and for houseboys, they must get black servants, Heisu. If it is otherwise, they are said not to be deserving of becoming officials. Yeziqi does not expand on this statement whatsoever. It's just there in the text. Its hyperbole notwithstanding, it's probably not everybody had to have, but at least some people had to have these servants, these slaves. We nonetheless clearly discern from such a statement that on the eve of the founding of the Ming dynastic state, owning young Korean women who were long prized for their beauty, and owning black youths who were now privately procured mainly for their exoticness, had risen to the level of a fetishistic mark of status within the circle of some interminable portion of China's native Han elite. Furthermore, the practice had assuredly by now spread well beyond its original localization in the south to the north of China. This is not to say, however, that there were no countervailing trends, for it is surely also with the arrival of the 14th century and the advent of the Ming that we begin to find the Chinese encountering blacks, certifiably African ones for sure this time, from what are now Somalia and Kenya, who were not slaves at all. Advancing to the early 15th century, we know that the fifth of the fabled maritime expeditions of Zheng in 1417 to 1419 took him and his fleet for the first time to the East African coast. Along with the sought-after commodities with which he returned to China, the eunuch admiral is believed to have brought back African non-slave tribute emissaries. In fact, part of the impetus for the 6 of the 7 total voyages of Zheng He's fleets, launched in 1421, was to guarantee these African tribute bearers, perhaps like the one that you see pictured here, safe escort, safe passage back to their native places. Although it is an obvious fact seldom noted and even less remarked upon, from the moment that Europeans began to appear in substantial numbers along Chinese shores at the very beginning of the 16th century, Africans made their presence too. They made their appearance too. These Africans, in tow as slaves of the Portuguese seamen, unlike those who had half a millennium or more earlier accompanied Arab and Persian traders and envoys, hailed chiefly from the western as opposed to eastern coastline of Africa, and had become captives as part of the broader Atlantic slave trade. The Portuguese merchantmen were at first ill-received by the isolationist Ming authorities, to say the least, and they suffered many setbacks, including incarceration and death in their attempts to open trade with the Chinese. However, persistence paid off when, in return for their help in sweeping the South China coastline free of pirates, these traders were grudgingly granted permission in 1535 to trade but not settle at Macau, Chinese Alman, a peninsula below Guangzhou on the west side of the Pearl River Delta. As we know, settlement was to follow within decades, such that by 1563, Macau had some 700 Portuguese residents and had become the port of entry for their merchants and missionaries, as well as for the travelers sailing northward from the Spanish colonies in the Philippines. Thus, as the oldest of European trade outposts in China, this peninsular post of Macau was established by the Portuguese. An untold number of black slaves who accompanied them were very much part of that establishment. The absolutely essential nature of their presence is underscored by an interesting historical event. Macau continued to prosper, and perhaps because of that fact, exclusive Portuguese control over the port did not go unchallenged. Beginning at the turn of the 17th century, rival Dutch traders tried repeatedly to dislodge the Portuguese from Macau and thus turn it into a Dutch possession. These efforts culminated on the 24th of June, 1622, when the Dutch initiated what became known as the Battle of Macau, sending an invasion force of some 800 strong under the command of Captain Cornelius Rearson. To their surprise, the Dutch invaders found that most of the defenders were neither Portuguese soldiers nor priests, but instead, anybody? African slaves. As the Dutch governor, Jan Cohen, was to write in 1623, following the defeat, the slaves of the Portuguese at Macau served them so well and faithfully that it was they who defeated and drove away our people there last year. He added further, probably just because he was so incredulous, our people saw very few Portuguese. Our people saw very few Portuguese. After this battle, the Dutch never again tried to conquer Macau. And it, of course, remained a Portuguese colony until reverting to Chinese control in 1999. The fact that Macau's slaves could be mobilized in numbers substantial enough to repel an invading force of 800 armed Dutchmen naturally invites the question of just how many slaves resided there. Reliable records reveal that up until the mid-17th century, that is, as much as 3 decades after this fateful episode of the Battle of Macau, some 5,000 slaves inhabited Macau, whereas only 2,000 Portuguese did. It must be acknowledged that not all of these slaves were Africans. Being among the last of the indiscriminate slavers, the Portuguese of Macau also held slaves from all over Asia. In addition to Chinese slaves, and the Chinese overall population of Macau numbered some 20,000 by the year 1664, not all of them enslaved, of course. The Portuguese also held in bondage Japanese, Malays, Indonesians, and Indians, with the last group comprising mostly women, with whom they often married. Nonetheless, we know that the preponderance of the Macau slaves was African, and thus they may well have outnumbered their captors by a factor of perhaps 2 to 1. We also know from reports contemporary with the time that they accounted for most of the victims in the Battle of 1622 for the territory. If you think that at least those African slaves of Macau, fortunate enough to have survived, might somehow have been rewarded for their staunch defense of the colonial foothold of their masters, then you are destined to be disappointed. Certainly, the reward of manumission was out of bounds. Moreover, as one of the earliest and staunchest European leaders of the slave trade, despite terminating the practice in the homeland in 1761 and desisting from the transatlantic trafficking in slaves by the year 1836, Portugal did not outlaw the institution of slavery in its African colonies until 1869. And only when pressured by a treaty concluded between the United States and Great Britain for the suppression of the trade. Thus, unsurprisingly, in the end, and contrary to what would seem either fair or just by our present day standards, the grand victory achieved in blood by the Macau Blacks only had the ironic result of ensuring the continuation of their bondage on the tiny Portuguese holding along China's great southeastern shoreline for another 2.5 centuries. With this much considered and hopefully acquired, we can now find ourselves to be well poised for a return to the present. Albeit now nearly globally condemned, the forced trafficking and servitude that constitutes slavery has been a much larger part of human experience for much longer, by countless centuries, than has been the universal respect for individual liberty. We should therefore expect that its legacy should be lasting and that its full eradication can only occur in a piecemeal fashion and with some considerable difficulty. I do not mean by a statement like this to suggest that the marginalized set of circumstances in which contemporary Blacks in China find themselves is tantamount to modern day slavery. The many Black immigrants and migrants, workers in Guangzhou would themselves attest immediately to their situations collectively being in advance over their prospects, the prospects that they left behind back in Africa. The members of an extremely small subset of China-based Blacks who comprise a physically dispersed community of corporate business professionals further north in Shanghai, mainly, these folks, these Blacks in China, are doubtless even more affirming of this reality, that things are better where they are than the place they left. However, mere occupancy of a place within any society is never the same as genuine integration into it. And there's much work on a Herculean scale to be begun and completed before present-day Blacks of China can be said to have progressed at all along that particular road. Moreover, owing to the upper hand that Beijing wields in the current scramble for economic advantage there, Africa itself is fast becoming, both in name and in truth, China's second continent. Thus, the sooner that China itself comes to realize, appreciate, and simply deal in human terms with the fact that its Black constituencies increasingly reside not just within its own borders, but also well beyond them, then the better. Such are my remarks.
So you will like banana oil a long time?
Yes.
Okay. No problem?
So this used to be like a very traditional village in the past, and the city of Guangzhou grew really big, and it surrounded the village. Now it looks only like a neighborhood, and living here or renting houses here or like staying in hotels here is much more cheap than any other place in Guangzhou. So that's why many foreigners, including Africans and Middle Eastern people, that's why they all stay in this part. And most of the Chinese people that you saw inside are actually China's internal migrants. This means this is people from other parts of China that come and they start cooking all these foods, they start like doing business there. So most of the people here are transient people, people on the move. Not only Africans, not only other foreigners, but also Chinese people living here. Everybody's on the move here.
Well, I was just wondering if they have done, or someone has done, any oral histories with the descendants of the Blacks in Macau, because if they're still there and they don't have any ancestral stories to tell, or
They're not really there.
they're not really there?
No.
After, in the 90s, they...
This particular group, there was a phenomenon of escaped slaves, and even in the probably even as late as the early 18th century, we do have records of travelers, missionaries, making references to these slaves. Eventually, they die out as a people. They keep referring to these so-called escaped slaves, and I have some juicy material in that regard.
Well, tell us.
Well, one particular reference talks about, as this traveler is complaining that he's just been robbed, and he says something about encountering a Black who is basically, he's a kind of street preacher, and he's going about baptizing Chinese children. And it took me a while to figure out a remark that he makes. He says something about, obviously he baptized these people, these innocents, very well, because they went straight to heaven upon their deaths or whatever. But it took me a while to figure out this statement. He's being sarcastic. And he said he attempted, he thought about trying to berate or correct the sins of this particular Black preacher, but the guy sort of wandered off, escaped, and he couldn't catch up with him or something. He was distracted. So there are these strange little vignettes that you sort of rare sightings, glimpses, but eventually everything fades to black, to use a phrase, not to pun, I guess.
You know, I don't think we ought to be trading in typologies of labor systems. You know, I think the people who have written extensively on plantations, for example, plantation typologies, have something to say about, you know, the hybrid nature of these types of labor, the hybrid natures of plantations. But I was just wondering about the traders, African traders in going to China, and it seems there are more and more African traders themselves going to China.
Mm-hmm.
What's the relationship between traders, say, and this what one might call loosely a diasporic African population there?
Well, it's economically based. They're going because of the profits to be had. There's some estimate that as many as they haven't all stayed, but there's some estimate over the past decade as many as 200,000 Africans have gone to China. Many of them, of course, have returned back to Africa, migrancy. But it's there are profits to be had, and that's why they're there. And they are really localized in this one area that we got a glimpse of. And there's a kind of overall kind of transience, as the narrator of this film described. People on the move. Um, Wherever there are economic gains to be had, you're going to find people trying to take advantage of them.
The slaves of the Portuguese and their attack on the invading Dutch.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know if you all were here for that. Yeah, you were for that part of it. But one wonders what their motivation was in setting out in that battle. Did they have their own conflicts? I mean, from everything that we know from the complexity of the Haitian Revolution, you know, it tells us that we shouldn't assume that they are acting as sort of, bodyguards,
Yeah,
or
lackeys. Yeah.
are there any documents that could shed any further light on what that conflict was about?
There probably are. I'm casting around for them. Will be. Um, there is a whole literature that has grown up about the whole phenomenon of arming slaves, because it seems such a counterintuitive idea, but this was a common practice, and I found other contemporary literature, Chinese writing about um, slaves basically protecting the homesteads of their masters, European masters, and how vicious they were, and how one of the testimonies says something to the effect that even if the house were burning down, they would continue to defend the homestead against against robbery or attack or what have you. So scattered literature, you got to sort your way through the biases and the fragmentary nature of things. But it's there to be had. I'm convinced that it holds some importance. So I'll continue trying to mine it.
I'm kind of curious as to what the level of sort of integration of Africans into Chinese sort of cities or districts are, like how well defined the diasporas are.
You mean right now?
Yeah, right now, or how you see that in the future too. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a funny sort of thing. It's almost like there's there's a lot of there are a lot of possibilities there, and I think progress has been made. But you find a lot of the same biases too, and how integrated are they? The state is, they're very concerned about, because a lot of the illegal immigrants or migrants are people who have sort of overstayed their visas. So there is that problem. But it's almost like the Chinese state has accepted a situation like the market we saw in Guangzhou as sort of a necessary. It's a fair trade. It's a fair exchange for their own involvement in Africa. Um, whether either of these have much permanence, because by integration, your question about integration, I was wondering if are you implying a kind of permanence or something, or long term?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of two levels. One is whether like the state kind of incorporates them within, whether it's healthcare, education, and then on a second level, more of the social cultural, like whether they're able to reconcile the Chinese sort of like normative values. Yeah.
Hmm. I think both of those are happening. There are great profits to be had on both sides. And there's a sort of symbiotic, beneficial relationship. And I think the trend is probably in favor of things coming more together. Also, China feels like it has a corner on the African market, and they're not inclined to let it go. So they're going to probably allow a lot of latitude with respect to the integrated prospects for the future.
I think in recent developments, the Chinese government had decided to open up land ownership to immigrants in China as a way of solving the housing crisis that China has been going through. So that's a clear indication that there is a possibility here of integration. I don't know if at the human level, the population level, that's the case, but at least from the perspective of the administration, opening up those possibilities is a good indication. On the other hand, there are a lot of interracial marriages today in China as well as in Africa, between Chinese and Africans in Africa and Chinese and Africans in China. So, for example, in order to be entitled to land in Africa, right, most Chinese who come with their businesses try to marry locally or marry their kids locally so that they are entitled to own land. I think those are ways in which integration is going to happen in the future. The idea, he also seems to suggest that China is mostly perceived in many African countries as a new colonizing power, right? That's just one perspective. But I think it's very difficult to categorize the China-Africa relationship in general. I think that the relationship they're developing is country-specific. So the relationship that China has with South Africa is totally different from the kind it has with Nigeria, for example, or from Senegal. So those are all things that we need to keep in mind as we investigate this. It's very complex. Yeah.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.